Where are you watching from? Midnight in your bedroom, maybe 2 in the morning when the world is quiet, or perhaps the middle of the day when you should be doing anything but this. Drop your place and the exact time in the comments. It is what binds this odd little family of night owls and history addicts scattered across the globe. Now dim the lights, lower that screen brightness, and step with me into Versailles. Not the sparkling palace of golden halls and mirrored ceilings that tourists wander through today. No, we're walking into a smaller, quieter corner, a house hidden near the palace grounds. The doors are shut, the curtains drawn, and inside waits a secret that has haunted France for centuries. The year is 1750. A teenage girl, no older than 16, is escorted through the back corridors of the palace. She's the daughter of a baker, her family poor, her hands rough from work. Tonight, she's dressed in silk she never dreamed of touching, her cheeks powdered, her hair braided into perfection. And she is terrified, because she isn't being led to a suitor or a husband, she is being delivered to the King of France himself, Louis XV. The man France once adored as the well-beloved, the monarch who was supposed to save his kingdom from decline. But behind the crown, behind the portraits that show him draped in velvet and glory, lay a man consumed by desires so insatiable and so carefully hidden that they became legend. He didn't just want mistresses. He wanted innocence itself. This was no ordinary royal romance. Louis created his own hidden harem, known as the Parc aux Cerfs, or the Deer Park. It was a set of discreet houses, furnished in secret, guarded with silence, where a stream of young girls were brought for the king's private amusement. Some came willingly, coaxed by promises of money and security for their families. Others were forced, handed over like tribute. They stayed for weeks, months, sometimes years. And when the king grew bored, they were married off to strangers or shut away in convents, their lives marked forever. Imagine standing there at 16, facing a man 3 times your age. The chandeliers glow, the heavy scent of musk fills the room, and the king's eyes settle on you like a prize. He isn't interested in your words, your dreams, your fears. He wants only your silence, your youth, your obedience. You are not a bride. You are not a partner. You are a possession. Versailles pretended not to see. The nobles looked the other way. Courtiers kept their lips sealed. And the palace priests blessed a monarch who spent less time governing than he did feeding his hungers. But outside the walls, Paris whispered. Pamphlets mocked him, stories spread in taverns, and the once well-beloved king slowly became the object of disgust. Was it exaggerated? Some say yes. Enemies of the crown always sharpened their knives with scandal. But the accounts that survive, from courtiers, from records, even from the king's own mistresses, paint too vivid a picture to dismiss. The Deer Park existed. Girls were taken, lives were broken. And here's the twisted irony. Louis XV believed this secrecy protected him. But every locked door, every silenced girl, every rumor whispered in the streets chipped away at the very thing that made him king, the sacred belief that he ruled by divine right. How can a man claim to be chosen by God while hiding his harem of frightened children just beyond the palace gates? This isn't the Versailles you were taught about. This isn't powdered wigs and polite dances. This is unfiltered history in incognito mode, the kind that drags the silk curtains aside and shows you the rot beneath. And before we go any deeper into the Deer Park, pause for a second. If these hidden truths are the kind of history you want to hear more of, hit subscribe right now. It's the one way you can keep this strange midnight community alive, because trust me, what comes next only gets darker. The streets of Paris once rang with cheers for Louis XV. When he first ascended the throne, the people called him Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved. He was young, handsome, and seen as a promise that France's golden age would continue. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders to glimpse him. Men raised their hats and women whispered prayers of gratitude. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The same king who was adored as a savior would be remembered as a predator. By the time Louis was in his 30s, the cheers had turned into murmurs, the admiration into scandal. Because while he wore the crown with the dignity of divine right, in private he indulged desires that stripped away that sacred aura. Imagine it, a king whose empire stretched across oceans, who commanded fleets and armies, yet spent his nights counting conquests of a very different kind. To the world, he was a monarch chosen by God. Behind closed doors, he was a man consumed by cravings, his palace echoing not with debates about governance, but with the laughter and cries of girls far too young to stand as equals beside him. It wasn't just about sex, it was about contradictions. Louis XVI would appear at religious ceremonies, bowing his head before the altar, while everyone in the congregation knew that just beyond the palace walls, his hidden deer park housed a rotating carousel of virgins. He could hold council meetings about the fate of colonies in the Americas, only to excuse himself early for a tryst arranged by his courtiers. The same man who spoke of duty and honor to his people treated women as consumable objects, discarded when their novelty faded. Some described him as shy, even awkward in public life. He wasn't the flamboyant showman his great-grandfather Louis XIV had been. Instead, he hid behind layers of silence, retreating more and more into his private world. The deer park became his refuge. Not just from politics, but from reality itself. Think about the hypocrisy. France was struggling. The 7 Years' War drained the treasury. Colonies in North America slipped away, and ordinary families faced food shortages. Yet their king poured money into silks, jewels, and secret houses, designed only to fuel his obsession. Every coin spent to keep the deer park running was a coin not spent feeding the starving poor. And the people noticed. Scandal sheets, what we'd call tabloids today, circulated through Paris, mocking the king as weak, perverted, and unworthy. Still, his contradictions ran deeper. This wasn't a man unaware of morality. Louis XV confessed regularly, spoke often of God, and occasionally swore to abandon his sins. But each time, he returned to the same patterns, as though he believed his divine title excused his darkest appetites. One day, he'd vow to close the deer park forever. The next, a new girl would be delivered, trembling, into its chambers. Court gossip added fuel to the fire. Ambassadors whispered that the king's queens and mistresses resented the secrecy, that noble ladies mocked him behind his back, and that even his own daughters despised the degradation his habits brought upon the family. When Louis walked through Versailles, courtiers bowed deeply, but their eyes followed him with suspicion, wondering how long a king could survive when his private perversions were the subject of public ridicule. The contradiction became his defining feature. A man adored as a savior, cursed as a tyrant of the bedroom, a king with absolute power, yet enslaved by his own appetites. His reign was a mirror, brilliant on the outside, rotten within, and the world would learn soon enough that this contradiction wasn't harmless. Because what Louis XV did in secret, the French people came to see as a reflection of the entire monarchy. If the king was corrupt, then so was the crown itself. If the king was perverse, then so was the system that allowed him to rule unchecked. The deer park wasn't just a scandal, it was a warning sign of the revolution that would follow. But before that fire consumed France, Louis XV continued his double life. By day, a king of ceremony. By night, the collector of virgins. And it was in those nightly rituals that the true nature of his hunger was revealed. Picture Paris in the mid-1700s, narrow, cobbled streets lined with bakeries, taverns, and candle-lit shops. Behind the chatter of merchants and the clatter of carts, another kind of trade was happening, one not written in ledgers but whispered in corners. Courtiers and royal agents walked among the people, not in gleaming carriages, but in plain clothes, hunting for something very specific, young girls who could be delivered to the king. This was how the deer park functioned. Louis XV didn't stumble across these girls by chance. They were recruited, handpicked and groomed for his private world. Families struggling with poverty were offered bribes they could hardly refuse, money to pay debts, promises of better futures, hints of marriages arranged by royal favor. Others weren't given a choice at all. Pressure from the crown was absolute, and when the king wanted something, refusal could be dangerous. Imagine being a parent in those times. You've got 5 children, mouths to feed, taxes that drain the last coin from your purse. Then a court official arrives with an offer. Send your daughter to the king, and your family will never know hunger again. Some said yes out of desperation, others out of ambition, convincing themselves their daughter's place with the king might bring prestige. But many wept as they agreed, knowing they were surrendering innocence for survival. The girls themselves were rarely older than their mid-teens. Some as young as 14, they were taken to discreet houses near Versailles, where they were dressed in silks, taught to behave like courtesans, and instructed in how to please the king. The deer park was not just a hiding place, it was a training ground. These girls were transformed from daughters of bakers, tailors and clerks into living ornaments for the monarch's pleasure. But the secrecy didn't hold forever. Servants talked, neighbors noticed, and soon Paris buzzed with rumors. Pamphlets mocked the king's school for virgins. Cartoons circulated showing girls lined up like treasures in a cabinet. And his once sacred image as the well-beloved turned into that of a predator hiding behind gold and velvet. The French people, already suffering from wars and taxes, now had one more reason to despise their king. And what about the girls? When their time in the deer park ended, their futures were just as controlled as their past. Some were given dowries and married off to minor nobles. Others were packed into convents where they lived in silence, their reputations forever stained. Whispers followed them wherever they went, once touched by the king, never untouched in the eyes of society. Even among the aristocracy, the system was viewed with disgust. Some claimed Louis XV wasn't just satisfying desires, but testing how far he could bend morality before it broke. Others suggested he used the deer park to escape politics altogether, retreating into fantasy while France collapsed around him. But one thing everyone agreed on: the recruitment of innocents became the crown's dirtiest open secret. Here's the chilling part. Louis believed he was untouchable. He thought secrecy and royal privilege would shield him from consequences. But every girl smuggled into the deer park was another crack in the monarchy's foundation. Every parent forced to surrender their daughter was another seed of resentment. And history shows us what happens when too many cracks spread through a kingdom. The deer park wasn't just a house of hidden pleasure. It was the place where the people's faith in the crown began to rot. And the same girls brought in to satisfy the king's whims would, in their silence and shame, help ignite the anger that brought down an empire. Step inside the deer park and you realize immediately this wasn't some gilded palace chamber for royal mistresses like Madame de Pompadour or Madame du Barry. This was something else entirely. A carefully disguised townhouse near Versailles, furnished not with grandeur, but with secrecy in mind. No parades of servants, no diplomats wandering through, just a handful of maids sworn to silence, and a series of rooms designed to hide the king's darkest indulgences. The girls brought here were given new clothes, new manners, and strict instructions. They were forbidden to speak of their families, forbidden to ask questions about the king, forbidden, in essence, to remain who they once were, their youth, their innocence. That was the treasure Louis XV sought to possess and to erase. For Louis, this was more than desire. It was control. At Versailles, he was constantly surrounded by politics, conspiracies, and courtiers eager to manipulate him. But here, in the deer park, he was absolute. No questions, no resistance, no obligations. Just silence, obedience, and submission. It was the only place where he could play God without consequence. The daily life of the girls followed a strange rhythm. They were dressed in fine silks, their hair styled with ribbons, their cheeks powdered to perfection. They ate rich meals, drank fine wines, and were paraded before the king like ornaments in a collection. At first glance, it might have seemed like luxury, but it was gilded captivity. These comforts weren't rewards, they were shackles. Every gift reminded them who owned them. Every silk gown whispered that they were bought and paid for. Louis's games went beyond physical pleasure. He would test the girls, forcing them to act out scenes, sing songs, or sit silently for hours while he studied them. He grew bored quickly, discarding one girl for another as if shuffling a deck of cards. The deer park became less a harem and more a stage for the king's whims, where intimacy was stripped of humanity and reduced to ritual. And yet he could never quite hide it. Courtiers noticed when money flowed mysteriously out of the treasury to maintain these secret houses. Servants whispered when girls were escorted through side gates at night. By the 1760s, the deer park was Versailles' worst-kept secret. Scandalous pamphlets in Paris described the king as a collector of virgins, mocking him as Louis the Lustful. This scandal was dangerous, not just because of moral outrage, but because it symbolized something larger, a monarchy obsessed with pleasure while its people starved. France was facing economic collapse, losing wars abroad, watching its empire shrink. Yet its king retreated to his hidden playground, convinced his sins could be hidden behind velvet curtains. The deer park wasn't just about Louis XV's cravings. It was a mirror of his entire reign: pleasure before duty, secrecy before honesty, indulgence before responsibility. The girls trapped inside those walls became symbols of a kingdom trapped under a ruler who couldn't see beyond himself. And every whisper, every rumor, every smuggled pamphlet chipped away at the sacred aura of monarchy. Louis XV thought he was safe in the deer park, untouchable in his control. But what he couldn't see was that the same secrecy feeding his pleasures was sowing the seeds of his downfall. Because a king who treats people as possessions can only rule for so long before the people themselves rise up and decide they are done being owned. By the 1760s, Paris had turned into a theatre of mockery. Coffee houses buzzed with gossip about the king's secret deer park. Pamphlets, cheaply printed and passed hand to hand, described Louis XV not as le bien-aimé, the well-beloved, but as le débauché, the debauched. Caricatures showed him as a bloated figure, surrounded by terrified girls, while starving peasants looked on from the margins. The satire was brutal, and for once it stuck. France had always known its kings took mistresses. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had paraded his lovers openly, even elevating them to positions of influence. But there was a difference. The mistresses of the Sun King were glamorous women of status, symbols of courtly love and political alliance. Louis XV's deer park was something else entirely, secret, sordid, and shameful. There was no glamour in forcing poor girls into silken prisons. There was only humiliation. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. This was the king who bowed his head at mass, who claimed his authority came directly from God, yet who spent the nation's money on houses filled with young virgins. This was the ruler who demanded obedience from his subjects while refusing to discipline his own desires. Even within Versailles, nobles whispered. Some detested him for degrading the dignity of the crown. Others feared that his scandals might spark unrest in a kingdom already strained by war and debt. Courtiers who once competed for the king's favor now wondered whether proximity to him meant being stained by his reputation. The mask of divinity that had shielded French kings for centuries was cracking, and behind it was not majesty, but weakness. For ordinary people, the deer park became a symbol of betrayal. While bread prices rose and peasants struggled to feed their families, they imagined the king feasting in luxury, surrounded by terrified teenagers forced into his bed. It didn't matter whether every rumor was true. The perception alone was enough. The idea of a monarch gorging on both food and innocence while his people starved made the monarchy itself look rotten to the core. The hypocrisy deepened in Louis's later years. He grew more visibly pious, insisting on displays of religious devotion while continuing his secret indulgences. He confessed, he prayed, he promised reform, then returned to the deer park as though God himself were powerless to resist a king. To the French people, this wasn't just perversion. It was blasphemy. Writers seized on it. Voltaire mocked the king as a man too weak to govern himself, let alone a kingdom. Satirists compared Versailles to a brothel, its golden halls nothing more than gilded cover for corruption. The deer park became a metaphor for France itself, beautiful on the outside, rotten within. And here's the real danger. The king didn't see it. Louis XV believed his crown made him untouchable, that gossip could never touch a monarch. He thought secrecy was protection, when in truth it was poison. Every whispered rumor eroded the sacred aura of monarchy. Every scandal turned loyalty into resentment. By the time the truth about the deer park reached the people, the king's reputation was beyond repair. Louis XV once inspired cheers when he walked through Paris. By the 1770s, those same streets greeted him with silence, no applause, no joy, only cold stares at the man they once adored, a king who had traded love for lust, respect for ridicule. And yet, the story doesn't end with pamphlets and gossip, because when Louis XV finally faced death, the same man who had spent his life collecting virgins would die abandoned, despised and shunned by the very people who once called him well-beloved. But before that moment came, the deer park still cast its shadow, feeding the anger that would soon explode into revolution. Picture the king's final days, not in triumph, not in grandeur, but in decay. By the mid-1770s, Louis XV was an old man, his once celebrated charm replaced with a bloated body and failing health. The man who had spent decades chasing youth in the form of fresh-faced mistresses now found himself surrounded by whispers, isolation, and the smell of rot. His deer park was no longer a secret. The scandal had seeped out into the streets of Paris, staining his legacy permanently. When smallpox struck him in 1774, it spread quickly across his body. Courtiers, terrified of infection, fled his chamber. Priests hovered, urging him to repent of a lifetime of excess. But the very sins he was asked to confess were the ones that defined his reign: lust disguised as privilege, corruption masked as authority. The irony wasn't lost on those outside Versailles. While peasants had once knelt to pray for their king's health, now they muttered prayers of thanks for his suffering. Louis had always assumed France would forgive him. After all, kings were sacred, weren't they? But the deer park had stripped away that sanctity. When the news spread that he was near death, crowds in Paris didn't weep. They celebrated. To them, the king who had called himself bien-aimé, the well-beloved, was a hypocrite who deserved divine punishment. And in those final moments, the mask slipped completely. The man who had demanded secrecy, who had lived behind curtains and courtiers, was revealed as fragile, mortal, and hated. His body lay ravaged, not just by disease, but by the weight of his choices. The deer park had not just destroyed young girls' lives, it had destroyed his own. When his coffin was carried through the streets, the silence was deafening. No prayers, no respect, no crowds pressing forward to honor their monarch. Louis XV, once adored, died, unloved. His body was hurried to Saint-Denis in the dead of night, as though France couldn't wait to bury the shame of his reign. But death didn't erase the memory of his perversions. If anything, it made them louder. The deer park became a whispered legend, proof that kings were not divine, but corrupt men hiding behind crowns. His scandals weakened the monarchy itself, planting seeds of resentment that would soon grow into revolution. Because when Louis XVI, his grandson, inherited the throne, he didn't just inherit a kingdom. He inherited the anger, the mockery, the disgust that Louis XV had created. The French Revolution didn't erupt overnight. It smoldered in the memories of people who had watched a king trade their loyalty for lust. So when you think of Louis XV, don't just think of palaces, parties, and power. Think of the deer park. Think of the terrified girls forced into his chambers. Think of the people who once adored him, turning away in silence as his coffin passed by. That silence spoke louder than any revolution. The monarchy was already dead in their hearts. And now I'll leave you with this thought. How many empires, how many dynasties throughout history have crumbled not because of foreign enemies or battlefield defeats, but because of the rot that started in the ruler's own bedroom? Where are you watching from tonight? Midnight in Paris, sunrise in Manila, or somewhere in between? Drop your place and time in the comments below. I love seeing this strange community of history lovers gather from every corner of the world. And if you want more stories like this, raw, unfiltered, the kind of history they'll never teach you in school, make sure to subscribe, because this is just one king. There are countless more shadows to uncover.